Hello and welcome to the Beyond Biotech podcast number 122. I'm Jim Cornell and this is the weekly podcast from Labiotech. Our conversation this week is about financing. It's a very informative discussion on early stage biotech valuations, pipeline evaluations and much more, including the developing Eastern European biotech scene. And so our guest on the podcast this week is the founder of ambiom, Adam Marťák. To kick things off, I wonder if you could tell me a bit about the company.
Sure. Maybe I'll tell you just a little bit about what led to the company being founded. So I'm somebody who spent almost 10 years now on the commercial side of life sciences. And back in 2020, I returned back to Slovakia to help shape the policy for reimbursement of drugs and medical devices, including setting up of the HTA agency. And I was getting some requests during the time for consulting on various matters, which I couldn't take as a state employee. So following my departure from the Ministry of Health, I set up the company purely initially for the reasons of being able to invoice on these kind of odd projects that people were asking from me. And 2.5 years later, it's grown nicely in a kind of a consulting company focusing on three main service areas on the commercial side of life sciences. So on business development, which is basically whatever you would understand under BD in the life sciences, meaning from direct sales all the way to more complex dealings like licensing deals. And we don't do any M&A, but anything between that two ends. Market access, which concerns really, the necessary steps that the companies need to take to get the products to the reimbursement system in the respective countries. And tech transfer, which is also partly the BD service line, but is specifically focused on helping scientists and academic institutions spinning off the intellectual property into a company in a successful and a mutually beneficial way. So we operate from Bratislava, Slovakia, and been operating for about 2.5 years.
Are many of your clients in Slovakia and Eastern Europe?
Yeah, so that's actually quite interesting. So we're headquartered in Bratislava, operating from Bratislava. I spent most of my career in Austria, in Vienna, so there was a natural tendency to focus more on Austria as a country, on the clients there. So I would say it's about 20 to 80%, meaning 20% of our clients so far have been from Eastern Europe. The majority actually have been from various countries in the EU. I think one of them was also from outside of the EU. We have clients from Eastern Europe, but it's definitely not the majority of clients that we have from Eastern Europe.
Is there much of a biotech or biopharma scene in that region?
Very good question. And it's just to be very frank about it, or just to really pinpoint this, there are very great differences between countries in East Europe in terms of how far the biotech scene has been developed. So here in Slovakia, unfortunately, I have to say it's still very much lagging behind, not just the Western Europe, most of the Western Europe countries, but also lagging behind some of the Eastern European neighboring countries, which are typically compared to Slovakia as kind of a benchmark. For example, in Lithuania, recently there's been a initiative to build $7 billion or to invest $7 billion to build a biocity in Vilnius, in the capital of Lithuania, which is going to be, when it's finished, the largest biotech campus or biotech city, so to speak, in Europe. In Estonia, there's a booming digital health scene, and there's also activities when it comes to biotech in the Czech Republic and in Hungary. So it's picking up, and there are great regional differences. That's the point I would like to emphasize.
Is that kind of the key, to be differentiated in some way? Like you just mentioned that digital health in Estonia and Lithuania is doing something slightly different. Is the key to try and focus on some kind of niche?
I think to an extent, definitely. Yeah. So Estonia historically has been very strong in anything digital. So over the past 15 years, I think it's one of the most digitized countries in Europe. And there's also this option to, get a e-residency in Estonia, like basically a second citizenship almost. So naturally, the digital health as an area is something where Estonia could have built on this foundation. And it definitely, I think, is helping Estonia to get on the map of biotech as such, just because it's already had this strong foundation. So I would say it's key if there's already strong foundation in the country. Or for example, in Austria, just as an example, Austria or Vienna has had a very strong history of immunology and oncology research, and the biotech scene in Austria has been basically built on this research. So it's much more developed, of course, than what you normally find in most of the Eastern European countries. But again, the same principle, basic research or the background of the country, of the region in a certain area, which was then utilized to, break into the industry as such. I spent a big chunk of my career in the innovation ecosystem in Austria, and I also done back in the years my master thesis on the external funding sources of the life science startups in Austria. I was able to, intern at the Governmental Development Bank in Austria, the Austria Wirtschaftsservice, and I would say that I was able to gather a fairly good idea about how has this ecosystem developed, and it's been really quite interesting. Vienna has had, and also many other universities or institutions in Austria have had a strong background in different areas for long. So the basic research in infectious diseases, so it's been very strong in generally in Austria-Hungary has been one of the strongest research areas. But also in terms of oncology, vaccine development, and immunology as such. So it's been very heavily focused on certain areas. So generally speaking, Austrian life science ecosystem about 30 years ago, so we're talking early, mid-90s, was I don't want to say non-existent, but it was not really, as flourishing as now. So I was able to get a lot of insights into how has the development of the ecosystem, how it has progressed. And there are basically a few pillars that I've seen that have really propelled the ecosystem to what it is now, with exits in the order of hundreds of millions in some cases. First thing that I've identified is that there was Boehringer Ingelheim, or let's say a big pharma company, big private investor, has decided to open a big research and development center in Vienna. So the Vienna Center of BY is one of the largest ones in the world for BY. It's where all of the oncology development for BY is being done. There's also a small animal health division. And why I think this was crucial is that it's produced certain critical mass of people that were well versed on the R&D side, not just with the basic research. They were able to do research, but they got insights into the stages of developing a drug, which has produced basically people, hundreds of, if not thousands of people that are trained in this, just in the Vienna region. There are, of course, companies like Takeda now, and then Pfizer and Novartis also with their manufacturing centers. But I think the Boehringer Center has played the major impact on how the ecosystem developed. Secondly, it was the early success. I think it was like the late 90s, early 2000s, when a few of the companies that were present already in Austria made a big success. So the same concept of a company making it to the IPO, I think one was called Intercell. So Intercell, I think, went public, and a lot of people got rich because of this exit, and they also got the experience of running the company from the beginning to the end. That has also produced people who were acting as kind of business angels in the environment. So now you had people who understand the R&D. Apart from the basic research, you had people with some kind of experience of success with funding, and they were acting as business angels. And the third, let's say the major thing is the non-dilutive funding environment that is present in Austria. So I've done the master thesis research on this, and you can get more funding, non-dilutive, as an early stage biotech in Austria or in Vienna specifically than in Germany or in Switzerland. I counted it up, it's up to 3.5 million, or it was 3.5 million several years ago, that you could get equity free in form of grants or potentially loans that you had to pay back if you were successful, but essentially equity free. And this is absolutely crucial for the start, because for digital health and for IT companies, most of them, you need two smart heads or a few smart heads and a laptops, and off you go. But with biotech, it's extremely front-loaded when it comes to the investment, and you need to set up your own lab. You need to buy services from external parties. They're all really quite expensive, especially for early stages. It's priceless to some kind of funding which covers your lab expenses, your first stages of R&D. I've had people from the US asking me that, I tell them about Vienna, about the Austrian ecosystem. They ask me, okay, but what is the quality of the companies? And it's true that the private capital has typically does more rigorous due diligence on where to put the money. But still, for many, many companies that are now successful in Vienna or in Austria, would not even have started, would not have even emerged had it not been for the funding they were able to get from either the funding agencies, the investment bank of the government, or even the city of Vienna has grants that it offers to the early stage companies. So this all gave rise to, I would say, almost like a perfect storm of propelling this forward. And Austrian life science ecosystem right now is one of the, I don't want to say, it's still not mature in terms of there's still gaps in the funding, but in the region of Central Europe is one of the most quickly growing ones. And there have been recent exits. So MySugar, big exit, Temis Bioscience, also a pretty large exit. So exits are happening already. I'm bringing this up because this is exactly, I think, the recipe for all the other Eastern European countries. You need some kind of a critical knowledge, critical mass of people where they've had some success. They've seen the product and the company go from scratch all the way to, IPO to an exit. Those are also the people that act as business angels and that can propel the whole industry in their respective countries forward.
I know that it would vary from company to company, but typically what kind of services do you see startups requiring?
Yeah, it's quite often the case that, life science spin-offs or startups are particularly front-loaded when it comes to the necessity of external capital and the accompanying R&D expenses. So apart from, the mentioned digital health, where it can really be that you need only, a few laptops and smart heads to start a company. Typically, if you start a biotech startup, you need a lot of upfront investment, and most of that investment is spent on R&D as such. That's for quite a long time before you see any reasonable profit in the company. So it's quite often the case that the teams are almost completely academic. Quite often they've never done anything else apart from academic research. Therefore, the startups or the spin-offs in the biotech and life sciences sectors, they often need support in areas like planning of future market access, even starting to think about market access. It's very important to think about how your drug is eventually going to be reimbursed once you start developing the drug. It's actually one of the things that most startups do not do at the beginning. It's a mistake. Also securing funding, kind of regulatory guidance, and helping with navigating the IP management landscape. So anything that is of commercial nature is quite often missing. Not always, but quite often is missing from early stage companies.
What kind of services do you offer that can help startups?
The services that we get paid for and that we can offer that bring the most value are compartmentalized into these three service lines that I mentioned. So BD as business development is really a service where we offer anything from acting as an account management company, or we allocate a person or people to a specific project where they act as account managers for a company, trying to break into the region, trying to get the first market traction, all the way to more complex things like navigating the product strategy, looking at the portfolio, making audit of the portfolio of the products or services that company is offering currently, or the current strategy, commercial strategy, and auditing the strategy, all the way to asset valuation. So we know, let's say, the industry benchmarks, the metrics that are typically used by either big pharma or the VC funds that are looking to invest into early stage biotech companies, and we can help them with valuing the assets that they have at the early stage. So that's on the BD side. On the market access, that is for more mature products. This is not always for early stage companies. Sometimes yes, but quite often it's for companies that already have the product on the market. They're looking to understand how could their product be reimbursed in a certain geography. We have the experience with Austria, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Ukraine, where we more or less understand the process and can be helpful in that. And tech transfer, so this is specifically tailored for companies which are being formed basically at university. So there is this whole issue of transferring the IP, which has been produced at the university or at the institution, and how do you negotiate the future ownership of the company that is being homed to this IP. So those are typically the three types of services that we offer to the companies. And as you pointed out, it is true, most of them are actually early stage.
Are there variations between countries and between universities even when it comes to things like tech transfer?
Absolutely. So as an example, Sweden is the only country in EU where researchers, they own the IP that they've invented. So even though they work at a publicly funded university or institution, if they develop an IP, they're basically an owners of the intellectual property. It's not the university or the department at the university. And therefore, it's much easier for them to, start something up with the IP. And this whole process of negotiating the ownership of the future company is not as complex as in many other countries. In most of the other countries, it is the case that the IP is typically owned by the institution. And if a new company is being formed, then you need to negotiate on behalf of the company with the institution. How is the transfer of the IP, the tech transfer of the IP, of the patents from the institution to a company going to look like? Yeah, and what are the future rights? And this is very complicated because typically VCs or the investors, early stage investors, they would expect that the IP is completely owned by the company, by the newly formed company. But in some cases, the institutions would much rather just license the IP, keep it in-house and license it out. But then it hinders getting future investment. So there are major differences even within the EU between how complex and how lengthy the process is.
Could you tell me what the difference is between early stage and late stage biotech valuations?
Sure. So inherently, developing a drug, or in most cases even a biotech platform, is very risky. Yeah, it's a very risky venture. That's why it's also quite heavy on upfront investments. You need a lot of money to even start up the venture, and there's still a lot of risk involved that it's going to amount to nothing. And on average, I think it's been over the past decade about 7.8% of the drugs that entered clinical development made it to the market, which is not a large percentage. And we're already talking drugs that made it to the clinical stage, which is not all of them. So it's very risky. And that's why the early stage biotech valuations are typically based on the potential of a pipeline or potential of an asset, of a potential drug, and need to account in many different ways for the risk that is present in this development. Yeah. So various things that could go wrong, ideally, should all be accounted for, and that's how you ultimately could end up with the current value. With a late stage biotech valuation, meaning close to commercial or commercial, let's say you mitigated the risk because you're already late stage. Yeah. So the risk is still there from various angles, but is nowhere near as high as in the beginning. And that's why you can project much better the future cash flows, the revenues of the drug in the years to come, so to speak. So they are much more focused on the actual projected cash flows in the late stage. So that's the main difference. Early stage potential, late stage revenues.
And what are the different valuation methods that are used?
For early stage companies, I would say the most common valuation methods include, on one hand, which is also standard for the late stage, is the DCF, yeah, which is called discounted cash flow. It takes into account the concept of time value of money. So that means that time value of money means that we assume that the money now is worth more than money in the future due to inflation, due to opportunity costs with the money. And it's a valuation method which is really heavily focusing on the cash flows, yeah, on projecting the future cash flows, discounting them back to the present moment, using one discount rate for to account for all of the risk, which could be then, of course, quite high in the beginning. And the last step of DCF could be so-called NPV calculation, which is the net present value calculation. And it is like the last step of DCF, as I said, and mostly it is used to take into account not just the cash flows, but also the expenses. And ultimately, ask yourself the question, is the project worth it? So the cash flows, you discounted them to the present moment. And you also look at expenses. And then if you get the negative NPV, then you know that, okay, well, probably the project is not worth it. And then we come to the most common method used by the big pharma, which is the rNPV. So this is just like the NPV, or you're asking the same question, but here you adjust for the risk of the development. So you make the risk more granular. So you use one discount rate for the whole valuation, but you account for the different types of risk by looking at the specific risk of failure of the drug in each of the stages. So the risk of not making it from the preclinical to phase 1, from phase 1 to phase 2, from phase 2 to phase 3, and then through the FDA or EMA approval. You can look at one drug for different indications. You can have one asset for 3 different indications. You can do this calculation, this rNPV valuation for each of these 3 indications. So that would be the third method, or second, depending on how you look at it. And the other common method used by the VCs and also some of the early stage companies is so-called VC method and comparables method, which is kind of a relative valuation method, where you're comparing the company to existing public companies based on financial metrics, or you're comparing the company to some kind of a benchmark deal that has happened in the past. And you're trying to look at either the exit value with the VC method, or with the comparables, you're trying to look at what would be the ratio of different financial metrics that you could apply to come up with the valuation for your own company. It's different from the first 2, or from DCF and rNPV, because it's relative, it's not intrinsic, it's not coming from the inherent value of the asset, but you're trying to estimate the value of the asset or of the company.
You mentioned that low percentage, 7.8%. So why do early stage biotech valuations offer higher upside potential for investors then?
Yeah, exactly. There's a reason. As you increase the likelihood that you're going to be approved. And of course, there are differences in different indications as well, or different disease areas. So, for example, urology has been notoriously difficult. So the approval rate is even lower than 7% urology. And on the other hand, the hematology has been, I don't want to say easy, but it's been easier to get drugs through. So as you progress through the phases of drug development, you mitigate the risk, or you eat away the risk, and you increase the value of the asset inherently. So, and this is also the basis of the rNPV valuation as such. In short, the early stage biotech valuations offer higher upside because you jump through the different clinical and regulatory milestones that make it more likely for your drug to get to the market and be commercial success.
Every company is different in terms of the assets that they have. So how do you measure the value of pipeline potential?
That's how the big guys value their own portfolios, is you would do a valuation of each of the assets for each of the indications. So the value of the pipeline potential would be the sum of the rNPVs, or different valuation metrics, and most commonly rNPVs for each of the assets that the company has, for each of the indications that these assets are supposed to be developed in. So there would be, let's say, the technical way. Of course, there can be other influences that can increase or decrease the value of the pipeline potential, but ideally, they should all be modeled in the rNPV as such.
Does a bigger pipeline guarantee more success, or does it depend on what the pipeline is?
It very much, as you say, depends on what the pipeline is. So not necessarily. Larger pipeline may suggest eventually a broader opportunity. But if you have a company which is laser focused on a single asset, let's say on a single indication and on a single asset, it doesn't mean that it's not a qualitatively good pipeline. It's a smaller pipeline, but you could have a broader pipeline with worse data. You could have 5 assets which have worse chance. They can all be in preclinical. The worst chance of getting to the clinic. They may not have such a good in vivo data. Or you can have one single asset in phase 2. So what is the better pipeline? So the breadth of the pipeline guarantees just potential opportunity, but doesn't guarantee more success.
Are there any adjustments or changes that companies can make to look more attractive to investors?
So, of course, there are some steps that a company can take. For early stage companies, still beyond the pipeline, beyond the internal asset, which is still quite important, the team is still majorly important to both investors and to potential partnership partners. So the quality of the team is one of the most important aspects, even if your asset is already on its way, so to speak. The patents typically last for about 20 years. Yeah, you can get some extension in different countries that range from 1 to 5 years mostly. But there needs to be some kind of a plan of how are you going to monetize the assets within the scope that the patent allows you. Yeah, because you start a development at the beginning of once you file a patent, it takes 12 to 15 years on average to develop the drug from start to finish. So you're then left with mostly with 8, 7, sometimes 5 years to monetize the asset. So it's majorly important that you think about, okay, can you prolong the IP in one way or the other? Could you get the extension in this geographical region or the other? Yeah, so it's really quite crucial for the success of the asset as such. It's also the, let's say, plan B or plan C for the assets themselves. So if there is a way of repurposing potentially the drug, if you get a good toxicity data, but let's say not so good efficacy data in your indication in phase 1, is there any way you could repurpose for a different indication? Or what would you do in case that something like this happens? If you can show this to the potential partners and to the investors, I think it shows that you take it seriously. If you can come up with a plan B or even plan C, I think it's hallmark of a well-determined team. Yeah. And this also comes to my last point, which is the clear commitment to the company. Yeah, so it's quite often you see in many European countries, at least is my experience, that biotech companies are developed by people who still work at universities. So they're like sitting on 2 tables. I still want to be a professor, but I also want to develop a biotech company, which is, I mean, it's fine. But of course, from the point of investors, they want to see, a clear commitment of the team to the company and to developing it. So I think those are, let's say, I don't want to say easy, but clear adjustments that the companies could make to make themselves more attractive, even if they already have a promising asset.
We've heard about AI potentially speeding up the pipeline. Does the speed at which potential drugs move through a pipeline affect investment?
It's a great point. And so AI has been, at least that's my perspective, it's become a buzzword, well, some time ago, but it's become a real buzzword maybe a couple of years, maybe 3-4 years ago, with the advent of ChatGPT. And so AI has been used in different ways in drug discovery for longer now. And it's coming into play already through companies like Exscientia. And Exscientia is basically utilizing AI to model in silico, so on a computer basically, different interactions of potential molecule, or just come up with leads for molecules much quicker than you would normally be able to do, with the high throughput screening, which is normally used. So it's playing an increasingly valuable role because it can shorten the whole drug discovery process rapidly. What you see on computer can be then confirmed in your actual experiments, and you see the different kinetic data on the molecule. So you see it really works, then you just save yourself and the company a lot of time. So it's certainly, because any time that you can save at the beginning is the time that you have free at the end of the development. So that's crucial. It's going to be increasingly important also for various IP or patent database searches and data crunching. So it's only get increasingly important, and it's already quite important.
Earlier, you were mentioning the different valuation methods. Which of those methods is better for biotech companies?
The main difference between NPV and rNPV as an estimate is that with NPV, the discount rate, meaning the percentage that you use to account for the risk of development, is very high at the very beginning, and it's rather inaccurate. So it's like you account for all the risk, including the cost of capital of the company under one, let's say, percentage that you use, and you come up with a valuation based on that. So this is basically the extension, I said, of the DCF. And with rNPV, and this is what I also mentioned previously, this is mostly the benchmark for all the big pharma companies, all the big pharma BD guys that you're going to be interacting with as a small biotech. rNPV is basically the same, but very different in the sense that it accounts for the risk externally, or in a way that is much more accurate. So you can get a different data on what is the likelihood that your molecule is going to pass for the different phases of development. And you can model your assumptions based on this. So this is why it's called rNPV. It's a shortcut for risk-adjusted NPV. As a small biotech, if you don't come up with your own valuation, your partners, future partners, and your investors, they're going to come up with their own, that's for sure. And it may not always be the one that you would have liked. It's more than advisable to come up with the valuation on your own, and then you can, if it's well defensible, which rNPV is made to be well defensible valuation, then you have also much better negotiating ground for your future partnership or for your investment round.
Are there certain areas of biotech that are doing better than others in terms of valuation?
Yes, and it's ultimately driven by the commercial environment for those drugs or for those areas of biotech. So areas like oncology, rare diseases, and especially gene therapies, so ATMP, so-called advanced medicinal therapeutic products, do better because the reimbursement environment is more allowing of these drugs as well. And also, by the way, the funding scheme. So there's a lot more grants, non-dilutive funding you can get for the development of oncology drugs than for development of new antibiotics, at this point. So they do better, and it's mostly based on the commercial potential success that they could have based on the reimbursement environment in different countries, and also the subsidies for R&D, which are not available for other areas of biotech. So oncology is now a very hot topic. You have many different, also cell therapies. You have so-called ADCs, antibody drug conjugates. You have immunotherapy, so that the checkpoint inhibitor is still coming up. So it's been a really hot area over the past 10 years. Also, the rare diseases are quite favored when it comes to the reimbursement as such. So certainly there are differences.
Are there things that affect valuation, like location and previous history and the people that are involved with the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I also mentioned previously, the team is crucial for the valuation. You can have a great asset, but if the team doesn't make the cut for whatever reason, it could not be just the quality, it could be the chemistry in the team. And a good investor or well-seasoned partnership partner, or company which would engage in a partnership with you would certainly assess also this aspect of not only how big is the team, but what are the backgrounds, can the people work together. So the staff is majorly important. Company location, unfortunately, it's unfair, but it's so that companies in certain areas, like in Boston, in some of the biotech hubs in Europe, they typically can get some premium on the valuation based on the location. It's been shown. And also the previous history is majorly important. So if the people in the company have had previous history, or even the company has had previous history of some successful launches in whatever area, or people have had experiences of getting the company to an exit or to a successful trade sale deal to an IPO, of course, then you can expect some kind of a premium on the valuation based on that. So that's also what I try to emphasize to our clients, that if you do an rNPV valuation for them, the valuation of the company could be different based on other factors, just as the cash in the bank, but also the non-tangible ones, like I just mentioned.
When it comes to patients, is there a difference in terms of investment and also for the companies themselves between companies looking to create an expensive drug for rare diseases and companies that might be targeting cheaper drugs? Is VC kind of shying away from expensive drugs or shying away from cheap drugs?
There is a discrepancy in between different biotech areas. And it's, of course, the case that the biotech VCs, which are taking even more risk than is usual for a VC to take on, they're looking for big returns. So they, of course, would be more interested in indications where the returns are more significant, or the potential for returns is more significant. And because of this, there has been a problem for decades now with antibiotic resistance. So it's been very long since new classes of antibiotics have been developed, and we get more and more resistance to various types of antibiotics that we use now. So we have big problems with MRSA, which is a hospital-acquired infection. It's so-called methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. More and more bacteria are becoming resistant to various types of antibiotics that we have. And up until very recently, it's been almost completely ignored. It's very good we're developing drugs for these also needed indications, but we may have a big problem on our hands in a decade or two if we do not do something. So I think there are some schemes now to support, for example, companies developing new classes of antibiotics or even repurposing old drugs as new class of antibiotics. I've also seen projects like this. But of course, the VCs and investors would mostly prefer the companies that are developing drugs where the returns are guaranteed to be higher, at least in theory. So this is, of course, a societal problem.
We often hear about funding being a major issue. Is it harder to come by now than it was in the past? And is that likely to change in the future, do you think?
Yeah, that's also a very good question, because 2021 has been almost named by biotech insiders to be this kind of a gold mine year for biotech funding. So lots of things converged together: favorable lending environment, COVID, which made biotech basically a worldwide topic. And 2021 became the best year ever for biotech investment, biotech funding. And it's led to a small, I would say, bubble. So there are some companies that went public under valuations which were way overshoot, which probably shouldn't have gone public at all in the first place. So depends on what kind of time frame we are looking at. So compared to maybe 20 years ago, it's probably still easier to get funding for biotech company now, just because there are more companies, more and more funds that are, aware of the field, are focusing on the field. There are more funds coming up in Europe, which wasn't be the case before. There are very few VCs in Europe that are focusing on biotech as such. So compared to 2021, it's probably harder to get funding right now, but generally speaking, the situation is definitely improving for small companies. And it's also quite often the case that once the company is successful, it goes public, that the people get rich, so to speak, and they become business angels with experience. So experienced business angels that are able to proper early stage biotech companies, in their local ecosystem. So it's definitely improving overall, but 2021 was the golden year.
A really comprehensive and useful look at the financial side of biotech there, and also a bit about the scene in Eastern Europe, so a great overview from Adam there. Don't forget to check out the latest news and articles over at Labiotech.eu, and I hope wherever in the world you are, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.